All right, everybody, this is the part 2 of my interview with Jeff Kaye. I will put the link to the first one on the article on China Rising Radio Sinoland, and which was about torture, and his book about Guantanamo. The second part is about bioweapons and germ warfare, and Jeff and I actually met through our joint work on the U.S.'s use of bioweapons during the Korean War, and then, of course, as we did more and more research, we found out they haven't stopped yet. And we are both founding members of the Bioweapon Truth Commission, and which I am extremely proud of, and I know you are too. Tell us how this became a parallel interest to you, along with torture in Guantanamo.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jeff, for those listeners who heard the first part of this interview, it really began as an offshoot, just a curiosity offshoot of my interest in the torture story as a whole, because when I was looking into the origins of the U.S. CIA's torture program, and I discovered that it was based on research done by the CIA, supposedly as a defense against Chinese and North Korean brainwashing. Well, what was that about? Brainwashing, So I just kept following it back. So, the brainwashing, the Manchurian Candidate. There was a movie made about it.
Yeah, the Manchurian Candidate.
And then when the New York Times or the Washington Post would have a story about torture, they'd say, well, these techniques were based on techniques that were used to produce false confessions under the brainwashing and torture techniques used by the Chinese. And what, the Chinese? And well, why do they do that? Well, because what were these false stories? What was so important? Why? Well, they were false. They were false stories, supposedly, about U.S. use of biological warfare during the Korean War, and that it turned out that there were a couple of dozen or so captured flyers, some of them quite high-ranking, who one of them was a chief of staff for the Marines, Marine Corps, who admitted and gave detailed information about being part of a program to drop an experimental program, at least initially, to drop biological weapons in North Korea and then later in China. And I thought, oh, wow, as I read through the story, so the Korean War has been called many times the forgotten war. But it was forgotten because the United States doesn't want you to know what happened there. The United States got its ass whipped.
Yeah, absolutely.
In North Korea.
Thank you. That's exactly what happened.
It was with the exception perhaps of the U.S. and the Philippines after the initial Japanese invasion, it was the biggest defeat for the American military ever. Yeah. And anyway, so the Korean War, the other reason the Korean War was, quote, forgotten was because many prisoners held by the Chinese and North Koreans were very sympathetic to the Chinese and the North Koreans. And the amount of collaboration, as the Pentagon would call it, with American prisoners, with their captors, was just overwhelming, far beyond and different than anything that had ever happened in any other war the U.S. had ever been in. And so they could, well, how could this be? And and of course, the highlight of it was the charges made by China and North Korea about biological weapons use, backed up by the confessions of U.S. flyers, some of which you can still watch on YouTube today. And I really highly recommend your listeners just do a little search on YouTube for U.S. confessions on germ warfare, and some various people have posted those videos now to the internet, and you can watch them and look for yourself. But the U.S. immediately came up with denied, of course, that they had done any of these things. And I found a document. I got into this, and one of the first things I found was a document showing that while the United States said we demand an independent investigation to look into this, we demand the International Red Cross be sent to China to look into behind the scenes, I found a document from something called the Psychology Strategy Board, which was actually a very high-level interdepartmental board organizing U.S. psychological warfare and integrally involved in the Korean War's planning, revealing, and made up by members of the military, the CIA, and the State Department, admitted behind the scenes, there's no way that we're going to, we're just saying this for for the public's, stance. Behind the scenes, we will never do it. We will never allow an independent investigation to take place because it would reveal things that the Eighth Army is doing that we don't want people to know about. Like, well, for example, the document said chemical warfare. Wow. Chemical warfare? What? I thought the U.S. totally denied that. So what? I started to look into this more because also I had because the story the story that's put out about U.S. torture included many people, of course, who were against U.S. torture, like the ACLU, like various Amnesty International, Physicians for Human Rights, etc. And these groups, sort of a narrative, a kind of what they call limited hangout narrative took place. And one of the things they said in this narrative went totally against my experience, especially my first experience of working with torture victims. And the narrative goes that these forms of torture that the CIA was using are not any good. They only produce false confessions.
Bad information, yeah.
Bad information. Now, I happen to know that wasn't true. Now, I don't know, I had no secret information about the CIA, but I did have and had worked with a man who had been tortured in Central America, working, in fact, El Salvador, who had been a member of the guerrillas there. And when they tortured him, he gave up names under torture. And that was very disturbing to him that he would do that, as you can imagine.
The guilt.
It was horrible, the guilt, yes. And he's certainly not the only person who this happened to. If you read history, you can read about people who gave up torture during World War II under Gestapo torture, people who, So while it is true that the kind of information that you can get from someone who's being tortured, particularly for that person doesn't know anything, they'll just tell you anything to stop the torture. Yeah. And of course, there are other people who will tell you lies and they'll try and deceive, or they'll tell you part truths. I mean, it's just, so the point isn't, so it was a lie to say it only gave false confessions, number one. So that meant that, how did they know, or why were they pushing this story that this was false confessions, during Korea? What really happened? And I wanted to know. So then I said, well, I read the books, the standard in the West kind of history books and articles that a person can read if they're interested. And I kept coming up across this one report. It was called the Report of the International Scientific Committee for the Investigation of Bacteriological Warfare.
Yeah, Joseph Needham, doctor, and you found it.
I did find it, yes. It was, this report was headed, as you say, by Joseph Needham, who was arguably the leading scientist from Britain in his day.
Oh,
he was amazing man. Even today, you'll find. I just read recently, as I was looking and read the Britannia article online that they have for Joseph Needham. But one thing they left out was his leadership of the International Scientific Committee Commission hearing. He was an embryologist. He was a biochemist. He was a member of the Royal Society, and he became a great historian of science who wrote, in the West anyway, the great compendium about Chinese science, and looking at questions surrounding, both restoring its the pride of place in the history of all world scientific endeavor, and trying to explain peculiar. By peculiar, I just mean peculiar to that particular nation, or idiosyncratic to that nation's development. He was interested in development because, of course, he was a great developmental biologist. And later, as a historian, he was interested in as to why various things developed. Why did Chinese science develop differently, let's say, than Western science? It's a good question, and so he looked at that. Anyway, but in 1952, he was asked to head up an international committee which had other scientists and medical people from other Western nations. The one exception being also included someone from the Soviet Union, to come to the China and North Korea to investigate for themselves, to look at the evidence that had been gathered, and to make a determination as to whether or not there was any reason to believe that biological warfare had taken place. Well, and of course they concluded, skip ahead, they concluded, yes, it did occur, and they published a 60-page or so executive summary detailing their findings, and then they also published separately along with, they published that in pamphlet form, and then in a smaller run they published a series of books which had their summary and 600 or so pages of documentary evidence, photographs, science, medical test results, interviews with people who had been there, interviews with some of the flyers, the Americans, they various monographs from the United States, all sorts of things, and put it together, and this sent the CIA and American covert operations into a tizzy, trying to counter this, because it was a highly scientific and reputable report.
It's a case closed. I mean,
case was really closed.
It was a smoking gun. It was a smoking nuclear bomb, and the United States, sent dozens and dozens of flights over North Korea and China, and they were dumping rats and moles and voles and spiders and all kinds of animals to try to give anthrax and plague and everything
Flanders,
else.
Unbelievable.
But luckily it didn't work very well, because the Chinese had the Japanese unit in Harbin all during World War II, and up until the Japanese left in '45, where the United States got this system from the Japanese after World War II. Ishiro, Ishiro Ishii, and
Shiro Ishii, yes.
Yeah, Hiro Ishii.
Well,
and
the U.S. had been developing its own biological warfare capacity since the early 1940s.
Okay.
And yes, but they were very interested because the Japanese had something the Americans didn't have. They had detailed biological, physiological case studies done on prisoners who were experimented upon and literally dissected alive. Vivisection to see what would happen when you actually subjected a large number of individuals to these various diseases. The whole point was to determine, how these diseases worked on people, how, did they work differently on different populations? So, for instance, they experimented on American prisoners at Mukden on dysentery, purposefully. And the Soviets gave this information to the Americans, who did their best to try and not look at it. And only recently has did a little looked at book by the Naval Institute Press, interestingly enough, in America, in the United States, published a book proving that in fact this kind of thing occurred. The Japanese, like the Nazis, had these racial doctrines, but there is something to scientifically looking at how different populations respond to different kinds of diseases, and the whole idea was to develop better bombs, better biological weapons from their standpoint, ones that were targeted. So but you're absolutely right that one of the main reasons that this warfare didn't work too well.
The Chinese were prepared. They'd been living with it for 10 years.
Exactly. They had had the experience of being
15 years
being victims of what was really a very large-scale biological warfare attack that we now believe, or even our Chinese sources are willing to admit, killed some hundreds of thousands of people. during
Hell,
World War
they
II.
were the Japanese were flying by, dropping deadly diseases with animal and insect vectors as far south as far south as Jiangsu. I mean, down by Shanghai. I mean, they were dropping this stuff all over China. So the Chinese knew, I mean, when the people knew, because the North Korea along that border, that's not very far from Harbin, which is in Heilongjiang, which borders North Korea,
right?
And
close to the Soviet Union as well, or Russia.
Russia. Yeah. And so when these farmers, woke up and saw on snow-covered ground, saw all these, voles and rats and spiders and creepy crawly insects, fleas. They knew exactly what was going on. So actually, it did not actually. Actually, it was a huge failure in terms of numbers of killed. But that's not what the Americans were hoping. They were hoping to exterminate North Korea and the communists in North Korea and the Chinese. Who were not invading, but helping the North Koreans beat the pants off of the Chinese, off of the Americans. I'm sorry.
Right. Boy, well, they very much wanted to use nuclear weapons, and in the end, even though Truman had the nuke sent very close by, ready to be used, in the last analysis, he did not do it, probably because. I was very worried that the Soviets would respond, and while they weren't exactly sure of the Soviet nuclear capacity, and while they believed, and people like MacArthur was saying, "No, probably this is a slam dunk. Don't worry about it." And while they believed they were far ahead of the Soviets, they couldn't be sure exactly, and it was just sort of like the United States with North Korea today. The U.S. is not willing to take a chance that Honolulu or San Francisco or L.A., much less Chicago, New York, D.C., would be subject to nuclear retaliation. Mm-hmm. And no doubt that would, certainly would put the Americans' ability to rule and protect their own people totally show it up for the farce that is, and it would, lead to the end of them. So they don't, they aren't really ready for nuclear war yet, hopefully. But biological warfare, they had this other thing, and there were it had its own proponents, and after the nuclear, after the amount of money and research that went into developing the nuclear bomb, the second amount of a program that had the most amount of research and interest was the biological germ warfare program. Highly secret, run out of Fort Detrick and other secret sites that the U.S., highly secure sites the U.S. had, working in many cases still with the CIA on these things. And, they began it as Tom Powell, who and we've worked with, who's son of the famous journalist John W. Powell, who helped reveal the Unit 731 atrocities to begin with, makes the point in one of his articles, I believe, that the initial, and this is backed up from my readings in the pilot's confessions which I found at the Imperial War Museum, which you mentioned, I think, at some point, initially, they began it as an experimental program. They'd never done it before themselves. I think they were working with Unit 731 personnel, who they gave amnesty to. The U.S. protected these war criminals.
Class A war criminals.
And kind of gave them, helped them, kind of, I wouldn't say they were in charge, but they certainly had incredible input, apparently. And decided to start the experimental program as early as 1950, 51, particularly 51. After the Chinese entered the war in late 1950, the U.S. pell-mell was in retreat as the Chinese overran the U.S. positions, and the U.S. was in full-scale retreat. And they used this experimental biological warfare to slow down the Chinese advance. Then, by May of 1852, 1950, and actually not by May of 1951. No, shoot, I see this is the problem. I don't have it in front of me. But anyway, at some point in there, late 51, early 52, the U.S. went full scale into an offensive biological warfare. That's where the bombing of China began, and in early 1952, and and I'd say for at least 6 to 9 months, I think they really tried to give it a whirl, the Americans, and as you say, they weren't getting the results that they wanted, and I don't know. I think by 1953, the biological warfare, the main offense was over.
Yeah. Of course, by that time they were trying to negotiate a face-saving deal.
Kind of. Yeah, right. I'm trying to sabotage it at the same time.
It went on forever. It still is on.
Yes, and it still is on. So your listeners, I mean, this isn't old news because, in fact, the war we're talking about still never ended.
That's right.
There's no
peace treaty. There's just a ceasefire.
Right. It was an armistice, or whatever they call that. Yes, ceasefire. And in a highly militarized border between the two, South Korea and. So I found this, so I went looking for the book. All right, International Scientific Commission. I'm a great believer that in everything, all I've done was I just wanted to look at the original documents. It's simple, right? Okay, it's a piece of history. I know Joe Blow over here says this is the way it was, but I don't know. That's just Joe Blow. Maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong. Let me see if what he's referring to is true. It's simple. Just look, just check it out. And it blew me away that I couldn't find this document.
The CIA,
it wasn't in any library.
MI6. They literally were buying up every physical copy they could get a hold of, and you couldn't find it. It was like gold dust. Yes,
it was, and the same thing went for another document, which was the publication of the pilot's confessions.
Yeah.
I said, well, if these confessions were so outlandish, so ridiculous, nobody could possibly believe what they had to say. They were just, this is what you say when you're tortured. You say anything. So you say gobbledygook. Well, let me see what the gobbledygook. Let me just look at the gobbledygook. You'd think that you would want people to see it. Aha, that was a tell already. If this thing was proof of torture, then they would be happy to show it to you. They would go out of your way. We would be in sixth grade. I might be looking at the gobbledygook portrayed by they were putting pencils in my eyeballs, and it would have been there, but there was nothing there. It was nothing. And then you'd find other things. So I was researching and saying, well, what about when these flyers returned and people returned, and they were debriefed, i.e., interrogated, maybe even tortured, for all I know. The man in charge, one of the men in charge of, I discovered, of the detainees and debriefings, meaning the discussions, the way we want to put it, that American security personnel had with the returning pilots, was a man by the name of Boris Pash, who, according to the revelations during the Church Committee years around the CIA, was in charge of assassinations for the CIA at the time. So,
they were forced to recant.
Yes, they were forced to recant under threat of court-martial. We do know that.
Court-martial, yeah,
if you don't recant, then you'll be court-martialed. And in fact, they did put on trial or begin a trial for one of them. It was the Marine Corps guy. His name now is suddenly escaping me. So many factoids running through my mind. In any case, couldn't find this book. And so I did something just very simple. I put a request in for one of these book sites. I think in this case it was abebooks.com, and it could have been Amazon. I can't remember. I think it was ABE Books, which now I believe is owned by Amazon, but whatever. And just saying, hey, if this book ever comes in, shoot me it's on my wish list.
Yeah,
And
Abe is
in Canada.
Antique book dealer.
Ah, okay.
It's
And
an
then
antique book dealer.
first I got the executive summary, which does pop up rarely because there were a lot more of them printed
Yeah, and it's in pamphlet form.
and I got one of those, and that was very interesting, and I posted it online because it had never been posted online. And so people could see it. I just thought, well, let people see this, and maybe I can help spread the truth.
But the real expose is the 600 pages of evidence.
Absolutely.
It's just like a sword that just smites all the lies and the cover up. I mean, it is so
It's 600 pages of data.
I mean, yeah, it's all been fabricated. Yeah, give me
a
break.
There were other, this was not the first time that information had been buried. So, for instance, the Soviets at the end of 1949 put on trial a number of the Japanese war criminals who had engaged in biological warfare that they captured when they invaded Manchuria at the end of World War II. And
Khabazov first, I can't remember
the Khabarovsk.
Yeah, the
Khabarovsk
trials,
war crimes trials. And they printed up a lot of books. Now, those aren't hard to find online. Yeah. I mean, they're not hard to find to buy. I mean, you can purchase one for $50-$60.
By the way, everybody who's listening to this, everything that Jeff is talking about is all available in the global online library of the Bioweapon Truth Commission, and just bioweapontruth.com, and all of the pilots' confessions that are publicly we have been able to find. The International Scientific Commission report is available there in English, in PDF form. We also have it in Chinese, and I actually have a copy waiting for me in French when I go back to Paris this summer. And so we will scan that and get that up there. All the movies that he was talking about, all the pilots' confessions, scores of hours of film are available at bioweapontruth.com. It's all, and then even recent research by Diliana Gabicin. I'm going to screw her name up right now, but the Bulgarian reporter, very brave lady. Who I interviewed, is still exposing, bioweapons being produced by the United States in Georgia, south of in the Caucasus. So all that's there. So everything you see, everything we're talking about, it's all available. Plus, much more is available on our global online library. So,
well, the reason that Khabarovsk book is now available is because I went to Google Books and I said, why don't you put this online? And believe it or not, they did. They determined that it was an orphaned book. You see, you have copyright issues, right? And they, so they won't publish but at the same time, and I don't think there's the same copyright issue either, but they won't put the ISC report online. But we've done it, as you said, and I've posted it on my articles that people can read, and you can definitely get it in the archive Jeff is talking about with a ton of other things that Jeff has posted there.
Well, you and
we have posted.
Godfrey Roberts and Tom Powell and David Pear and another guy who prefers to remain anonymous, but another guy has also made a lot of contributions to it. So you contacted I love these stories because you hear about people going to these libraries, and you contacted the Imperial War College in the UK as you were researching bioweapons. Please tell us why and what was that like?
Well, in my search for the International Scientific Committee report, actually in this case I was searching for the depositions. It was called. It was published in English. The depositions of 19 captured U.S. airmen, which was published by the Chinese. Which was the confessions that were supposedly false, but really in reality true. About how these people had been involved in U.S. warfare. And I'm not saying, by the way, that some of these people weren't given the third degree before they didn't want to give up this information. Although my research shows that most of them freely gave it, right? And in fact, over and over, the flyers mentioned that they were shocked at being told what they were supposed to do. And there was a lot of disgruntlement among the military.
They were pissed off because they were being forced to do something they were morally against, which is trying to spread anthrax and and the plague. I mean, that's just
exactly.
It's barbaric.
So I wanted these things to be public, and I wanted to read them myself. I still had not seen them, and I looked, and there was not one library in the United States that had a copy of this book, not one. And there's something called World Cat. It's like online.
World Catalog.
You can search the world's libraries, and the only one there was. I think there might have been another one somewhere, but the one that seemed at least somewhat approachable was the library at the Imperial War Museum in London. And so I wrote to them. I didn't go to London. I later went to London, but I already had the book. And told them what I wanted, and they were very, they treated it like a regular business transaction. They were very reasonable and charged me not that much to copy the entire book, which they did for me, and they mailed it to me, albeit with the proviso that I could not reproduce it and I could not publish it. So I have not, in fact, posted that online because, one, I don't want to burn my bridges with the Imperial War Museum. You don't know what else we might want to get from them.
And in any case, through other sources, we've gotten.
That's right. It turned out that later
on, there may just be one or two that are missing, but we've got close to 20, I think, the 20 confessions, including sketches and drawings of the bombs that the pilots drew and how they were dropped and how they were released. And I think you maybe have two or three that we don't have in that
are in that book. I'll have to cross-reference them all and see. It's possible there's a few there. Yeah. But if your listeners are going, well, how could lots of times, and I'll just say this because I don't know that you would ask me this, but a lot of people out there, they'll go back and say, I heard this great program that Jeff, Brown did, and, it's about the biological warfare, and somebody will just come up to them and say, well, how could that have been kept secret? How could that have been kept secret all these years?
Yeah, exactly.
How could you have a program that big and nobody supposedly knew about it? Well, actually, people did know about it, and their statements were suppressed. And by the way, I distracted myself when I was telling you, when they came back to the United States and were interviewed here or debriefed by Department of Defense, all of those interviews about what the flyers said when they came back and recanted, but all the interviews were lost in a fire. Supposedly. Yeah. Or I guess it probably really was a fire. They destroyed that evidence. So they've done everything they can to destroy the evidence and put it down the old memory hole. But they, lucky to say, that myself, Jeff, people for the Biological Warfare Truth Commission, and a few other people around the world have, tried to stay on top of this and rescue this evidence before it disappeared. Sheldon Harris was another one, although he was working on the Unit 731 story and the U.S. amnesty, and he too, along with John W. Powell, who preceded him, had done the lion's share of the work in, saving for us the reality of what happened, at least for Western years.
Wilfred Burchett, he was also in Korea during and actually talked to some of the pilots. And,
yes.
And the great journalist Wilfred Burchett.
The West has done its best to try and also suppress his writings. It's not so easy to get his books anymore. It's amazing. This, if you're a naive person, as I'd say I was at one point, and you go out there into the world, you think, oh, yeah, of course these things are there. And then you find out that the U.S. government destroyed them or has done its best to destroy them. It's pretty shocking. And I think it creates a cognitive dissonance. So what I was going to say is, how could this happen? But William Shawcross, who today is kind of a reactionary, but back in the late 1970s or 1980s, wrote a famous book about the U.S. covert bombing of Cambodia, also highly secret. not written down, covert program, hundreds of thousands of tonnage of bombs dropped on Cambodia, and a huge war crime. And in that book he describes how and it was very similar to what they did in Korea, in Korean War, and how these operations are kept off the books, how you lie about them, how, it's just, nothing is written down, and all of these things. So there is a methodology to conducting a secret war, strange to say. And part of what I have learned, and everyone out there who pursues this will learn, is exactly what that methodology is. Why, it's very scary, really.
And then you and I actually had the pleasure of meeting each other this summer in San Francisco with Tom Powell and Frank Scott. And you had just gone with Tom to the Hoover Institute at Stanford, and being two fellow Bioweapons Truth Commission founders, you were trying to dig up more information about biowarfare. What did you find, and what was that like?
Well, yeah, the Hoover Institute is a very, very interesting place. Of course, the room is jam-packed with scholars from around the world who come there. They have an incredible collection of works left over from the communist era, in terms of the Soviet Union, but the Pacific War and California history as well. And what they had there is they had the papers of the late Sheldon Harris, who wrote his book on the cover-up of America's amnesty of the Unit 731 war criminals. And so we went to see, because there's such a not interaction, but it's such a connection between Unit 731 and what the United States did in Korea. We wanted to look at whatever Harris had gathered to see if there was anything in there that would further our own studies in regards to helping expose what the U.S. did during the Korean War, plus maybe other things that aren't recognized that happened, with Unit 731 in general. And I'd say we are still processing that information. Data. It's really fairly recent. And,
Tom showed me you all each got about 200 pages each, so there's going to be a lot to go through, and hopefully some of it is not copyrightable, and we can get it posted on the on the
all U.S.
online
documents.
library.
See, the problem isn't the document. The problem is unfortunately he often wrote on the document. So what he wrote is copyrightable, but not the document, which we're also hoping to go. Tom's own father, John W. Powell, had his own papers put into the Asian Studies Library at UC Berkeley after he died. And those papers apparently have not really been scholarly put together well yet, because it's fairly recent. And but hopefully we'll be able to find things there as well.
Wow.
And but what just a casual look at this shows me that the involvement of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the CIA in the cover-up of Unit 731 was vast. Was much, went right to the top, right? So this was something that had the full attention of the top levels of American national security and military apparatus, and they, were doing these things even as they were supposedly prosecuting people at the Nuremberg war crimes trials, and Europe were doing the same thing.
Yeah, of course. And we're still the United States and the West are still using bioweapons. It's just unbelievable.
Yes, I mean, so you asked me. I think in the other part of this, what am I working on? One thing is that I'm intending to expose the fact, and this is a scoop for your listeners, that a man by the name of James Monroe, who was the leader of a CIA front group in the 1950s called the Institute for Human Ecology.
Oh, God.
Now, that's great for those people who are into this kind of thing. would know that instantly know what that is, because that was one of the primary ways money was funneled to the MK Ultra researchers throughout U.S. academia. And he worked very closely, James Monroe did, with people like Albert Biederman and others who were involved in the MK Ultra program and the program to control human behavior as they saw it. It's quite diabolical. And I was kind of shocked going through a document online, again, looking at the retractions of the U.S. flyers from their confessions. Those retractions were sent to, I was looking to read those, and I did find some of them online. I believe I forwarded them to you. I'm sure they're in the archive now. But, and in that, so there's a lot there for you independent researchers. If you're listening to me, go out there. There's a lot to still find. And James Monroe shows up as, on the introduction of these documents to the UN in the early 50s to verify, saying that he worked closely on these issues, and James Monroe on the retraction of the flyers' evidence. So here's a direct link in terms of one of the key individuals involved between MK Ultra, which was developing forms to torture, and the retraction of the supposed false confessions. Right. So this is a key figure. So now we're starting to flesh out. And so what you're seeing is, is not surprising, and discovered by Joseph Needham in their investigation, which a large scale attempt to utilize Japanese biological warfare and American developed biological warfare techniques was undertaken in China and North Korea in the early 1950s, and then covered up. Yeah. And and the crime, you can pick wherever you want the crimes of U.S. empire to start, whether it's going all the way back to the destruction of the Native Americans or slavery or wherever. But in modern times, it really begins, in my mind, with the total war, the concept of total war that was embraced by the United States, and its decision towards the end of World War II to basically swallow up take over Great Britain's role as the main empire, and to destroy national liberation movements, to crush the Soviet Union and China or any other state that was adopting socialism or communism, and to conduct barbaric forms of warfare with the dream of total domination, which they still have over the world and over people's minds.
Full spectrum dominance.
Yes. So we're talking some pretty heavy shit here. And, very unfortunately. And, it's really an open question for all of us living in the world today, whether, how this will all finally, be settled.
Well, hopefully after the fall of the American Empire, we can have a truth commission about all of the evil deeds that have been committed by Western Empire for the last 500 years, and you and I may both be dead when it happens, but hopefully someday it will all be divulged.
Yeah, hopefully so.
Obviously, other than your tremendous contributions to the Bioweapon Truth Commission and the global online library there at bioweapontruth.com, are there any books that you can recommend about bioweapons? So,
absolutely. The number one book was written by Stephen Endicott and Edward Hagerman. That book is called The U.S. and Biological Warfare. Has a longer subtitle, Secrets of the Early Cold War in Korea. It was published by Indiana University Press back in 1998, and it's still in print. And these guys, of course, Stephen Endicott himself, his father had been in China, was a missionary there, who also worked to expose the biological warfare way back in the early 50s because he witnessed it. And it's amazing how many of the children of the people who fought against this earlier still So that's a crucial book. These guys, did a detailed scholarly study, heavily footnoted, and still is the #1 book. Although they themselves would admit there's more to come out and stuff. The works of not too available, sad to say. Some of it is, and what is really important, by Tom Powell, T-O-M Powell. Writings,
Well,
you have to Google him, go to the archive.
Go to the archive, and he has his own subdirectory.
Yes. And there's a lot of books about biological warfare out there. Some of them, all of them have good points and bad points. I can't really recommend one versus the other. You really have to go out there and do your own reading.
But you especially like Endicott's and Hagerman's.
Yes.
Okay.
The United States and Biological Warfare. That book is, I go back, it's amazing, and it's 300 pages how much they packed in there. Wow. And if you can find it, you can download it. You can also read John W. Powell's. Google it, or it's on the archive. His writings on Unit 731 are very important. And
we also have Wilfred Burchett's work on the use of bioweapons also on the online library. So
very important. Yes, and he was an eyewitness in there.
Yeah. He actually talked to some of the pilots and so. Well, listen, you have been a marathon interviewee, Jeff.
Sure, thank you.
Between the two interviews, it's been an hour and 36 minutes, and I really want to thank you so much. And I'm going to spend quite a bit of time getting these split in two and posting them. And but you are first of all a gentleman and a scholar, and it was an honor to meet you this summer. And
yes, likewise for me.
And let's hopefully get together again in the future and stay in touch. And as you and Tom go through all of this stuff from the Hoover Institute that you can, and if maybe if Sheldon Harris maybe wrote some notes on government docs or whatever, maybe just redact that so we can get as much on there as possible, so that way it becomes public, it becomes non-copyrightable.
Sure.
But anyway, I know that's a lot of work, but anyway, thank you so much. I mean, these are not easy subjects to talk about. These are subjects that people want to avoid. People are in denial, and but the only way that we're going to come to terms with Western Empire is to reveal the truth, and you have taken great strides and done a tremendous body of work in that endeavor. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jack.
Well, listen, I'm going to let you go back to your beautiful sunset.
Well, today I don't think so.
Your sunset in Hawaii, and all the best to you in the year of the pig, and we will stay in touch as usual.
Okay, take care, Jeff.
Yeah, give me 24 hours, and I'll blast you, and I may send you some questions about some of these names that you gave us to correct the spelling and all that. So
no
I may
problem.
be in touch with you.
Okay,
all right?
Sounds good. Yeah.
Talk to you later. Bye bye.
Okay, bye bye.